Okay, thanks, Susan, and thanks to everyone for joining. So today we're going to hear about data management, which is near and dear to most of our hearts, I think, in CORE, from Alisa Beth, who is a research data management specialist at McGill University, so at main campus in the library. So she has training from the University of California system, a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in sort of diverse domains, but including political science and bioethics. So I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about data management plans specifically today. So the sort of document that you can draft for grant applications that covers all of the aspects of data management that you might be including in your research project. So I'll talk about what is a data management plan, and we call them DMPs for short. So why write a data management plan? What's the incentive? What's the point of that? Why should we be doing that as researchers? Where does this fit in the workflow of a research project? And I'm going to go through a tool that's been designed by and managed by the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, or the Alliance for short, which is sort of an organization that makes grants and works with the tri-agencies in sort of thinking about how to implement a lot of these data management best practices. And then I'll look at some examples, so what content can go into it based on some of the funding calls that have come out recently from CIHR, which have required data management plans for the first time. So we'll take a look at what those calls asked for and what are some potential responses that would make sense. And then I'll open it up to questions. So just take 40, 45 minutes, and then there should be enough time for questions at the end. So what is a data management plan? The plan is a documentation that it outlines the tools, methods, and procedures for managing your research data. So it's a description of all that. You could consider it a sort of parallel to an REB application or protocol that really details more in terms of the actual data aspect rather than the full study. And so it's really focused on how you're going to actively collect your data or create it, and thinking about in terms of whether you're going to share those data either with collaborators during that process, externally or internally, or later for preservation purposes or for depositing purposes. So it's about thinking about all of that up front and setting yourself up so that you have a plan to reach that goal. It is a living document. It can be updated. Unlike an REB application, no one is going to come check your DMP and make sure you're doing the things that you said that you're going to be doing. And a lot of the information you may not know, because you might be writing this well in advance of actually even applying for an REB or even implementing any part of the study. This would be at the point where you'd be applying for funding. So in that case, it's well before, and sometimes you have some intention or expectations about what you're going to do, and those change when you actually get the funding or you actually sit down to do the research. So it can be updated. It should be updated, just so it's a document that you and your team or whoever you're doing research with, even if it's a solo project, that you have a current version of this that sort of outlines where you're storing your data and what procedures are in place to deal with the data. So why write the data management plan? So first of all, they're useful. I mean, it's useful to sit down and really be explicit about what the plans are, who's involved with the data, where are the different kinds of data, what processes do the data go through? Are they more sensitive at some stages of the research and less sensitive at others? Are there versions of it that can be treated differently? So sort of planning that out, and even to this really detailed aspects of what are you naming your files? Is everyone working off the same file naming convention, the same folder structure? How do you share data among trainees and other researchers? And then there's also some new mandates that require that these plans be written at the point of time that you're applying for funding. So the tri-agencies came out with a research data management policy last year, and they're rolling it out very slowly, but the data management plan component is going to be one of the first components of this policy that's really implemented. So they've started to pilot data management plans being required at the time of the application. And at some point, they will be considered in the adjudication process. So in terms of the pilot, they've come out and said where they won't be scored as part of the grant. You'll just receive feedback on it at this point. But at some point in time, they are aiming to include those in the adjudication process. Many other international funding agencies have required data management planning or are going to require more robust planning, including compliance. So the NIH in particular is going really strong on the data management plans in terms of including them for most funding applications and having them be part of the overall score. And that there are some REBs that will require data management plans going forward. I know that the medical REB at McGill Central, if you are doing a project where you want to make your data open at the end of the project or some version of it, so if you're talking about open science or planning for an open science type of project, I know that the REB is asked now for data management plans attached with those applications. So that may or may not be very consistent, but I know that there are researchers who have been asked to provide these kinds of plans in addition to the full questionnaire, that template that they're asking for. So these are going to become more ubiquitous. And the way to be able to fill them out is to have good data management practices or to have some idea of how all of that works in your research context. So taking a step back, I'll just talk a little bit about where does this play in with the research data lifecycle. And so we think of research data as having it's conceived, it's created, it's birthed into the world, and then at some point it passes away, although it may have a much longer lifespan than the rest of us, ideally. But we're trying to plan for that whole life of that data. And that involves, like raising it well. So like planning for how it's going to be shared and collected and created, and how are you going to document the different types of data that you have? Do you have contracts involved with your data or data use agreements? So all of that coming up front. And then when you're collecting the data or creating it, using a convention to name files, using a standardized directory structure, having a clear system for version control, getting in the habit of writing README files at the data set level so that you can describe how that data set can be, or whatever the findings that you've published based on that data set can be reproduced by others or can be verified. So getting the habit of noting all those steps in a way that's very easily digestible by other researchers. And when you're analyzing and collaborating, thinking about the use of electronic lab notebooks, security implications for those, licensing implications for those, image management, if you're collecting images, those can be quite large, those files, or if you're collecting large file types. If you're using collaborative software, what are the parameters and the terms of use of that software? What kind of data can you put there? McGill Central, so if you have an affiliation with McGill, you're totally fine to use McGill's licensed enterprise Microsoft products, and that includes SharePoint and Teams, where you can store up to 25 terabytes per Teams. You can store quite an SharePoint site. So you can store quite a lot of data. It allows you to, share data externally and internally. It doesn't really allow you to compute on that data, but it is a good option for backup storage or primary storage. So one issue is to think about that you're allowed to do that, but for personal health information, the contract with Microsoft requires that participants consent for their data to be on SharePoint or Teams or the Microsoft product. So you can store it there if you're affiliated with McGill Central and you have access to that. But for PHI, and you can store highly sensitive data, PHI, but just to know that you would need consent from participants. So that would have to be baked into the whole process from the beginning of a project. And at this point, if you want to move data there now and you've already consented folks and that's not in the consent, then you can't move re-consenting them. So if it's PHI in particular. If it's just identifiable data with no health information attached to it or no clinical information, you can actually store it there without consenting them. So there's a distinction there with like that very highly sensitive data and just other kinds of personally identifiable information. But these are things that you would think about for your research data and what you're going to do with them and how you're going to store them and which versions of it can be stored where. And then you want to think through, sharing, disseminating, and making them accessible for reuse if that's appropriate. So the issues like reproducibility, if you're publishing an article somewhere and another researcher asks to reproduce your findings or to verify your findings, how do you facilitate access to the data? Are they deposited somewhere? Are you allowed to do that? What is you, at the beginning of a project, you would want to think about, what am I going to plan to do with this data at the end of the project, and have some intention. And that can be conveyed as just, we plan to release a de-identified version of this data set in a public repository that will be baked into the consent form. So that can be the way that you describe it in a data management plan. And I should note that this life cycle has been adapted from Harvard's biomedical research data management group. So they have a lot of really good resources, and I've included some links in here to that group's site. They have like a checklist for onboarding members to research groups and offboarding members in a biomedical context, which can be really useful. So I'll include that, and I think I'll be able to share the slides as well. So how to write a data management plan. So in the Canadian context, we have a tool called the DMP Assistant, which I'm going to sort of go through how you use that tool. And it has a series of templates. So there's some discipline specific templates. There's one for mixed methods, like if you're conducting surveys and interviews. There's a neuroimaging template. There's a qualitative health sciences template. And I know they're coming out with 10 new ones in the next few months. We expect those to include at least 1 or 2 more that are more traditional biomedical research. And that sort of gives you prompts to think about what kind of information would be expected in that particular discipline in these plans. They also have a series of primers and guides, so I've included links to that at the Alliance's site. There's also similar tools in the UK and the United States. So there's the DMP tool, which is sort of based off NSF, NIH requirements. And there's a tool from the UK that's based off of European funders. So they more or less have the same inputs and templates. The DMP Assistant has been developed in the Canadian context specifically, but they're pretty general. So you could use any of them if you want, or you could just look at what are the question prompts, and you could do it offline in a Word document or whatever you like. So to access the DMP Assistant, you would go to alliancecan.ca. It's a bilingual site, so you can access this in French or English. And on there, under services, they have research data management as one of their services, and they have a link to the DMP Assistant. You can also go directly to the site, but this is one way to find it, and also other resources related to data management. I've kind of taken some of their slides that they use in a lot of their presentations about the DMP, but it's hosted by the University of Alberta Library. It was developed there. I think they're moving it to be more central and managed through the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. So I think they're in that process. It's free, it's bilingual, anyone can sign up. You can sign up with any email and tag McGill as your affiliation or not. So you can do one or the other, that's fine. It develops a DMP by prompting researchers to consider and answer key data management questions. And those are supported by best practice guidance. And in some cases, there's examples as well. So you can create project plans using a generic template or a discipline-specific template. In some cases, there are institutional templates, which is on my to-do list to create one that has some specific guidance about the storage that we have at McGill and some of the policies that we have at McGill. But that's not in place yet. So you can also collaborate. You can invite anyone else to work with you on the DMP in the tool. And you can connect to some local resources as well through the assistant tool. So I'm going to go through some of the key features. It supports cross-institutional collaboration. It's freely available. It's web-based. It's bilingual, so you can use it in French or English, and all the templates are available in French as well. It's endorsed by the tri-agency, so it is specifically mentioned in recent funding calls. I'll show you a CIHR one that came out actually, I think, that talks about the DMP Assistant tool. It has guidance and examples. You can have multiple DMPs. You can have tons of them. You can share access at read level or edit level. So you can, give someone just read-only access if you want. And it's exportable as a PDF or a Word document or text document. So that can be very useful. You can modify it or update it whenever you want, right? It's not set in stone. You don't submit it to anything. It's just there to for you to work on as you need to. So if you wanted to create an account, you could go to the DMP Assistant site, and you would just sign, you'd go to create account, you would just say your name, email, and your affiliation. I think you could just put McGill. I'm not sure that the MUHC has their own setup in here, and I don't think that it matters that much because none of the institutions affiliated with McGill really have their own templates or anything like that. So you could put whatever institution. When you sign in, you would see a list of your DMPs, or you can create a new one. So if you haven't created one, you wouldn't really see anything here. Otherwise, you would see the list of the ones that you have already created. You can do several actions, so you can clone them, you can copy them. If you're working on a project that is similar to a previous one, that can be useful instead of starting over. You can edit them and you can share them. So when you go to create a new plan, they're going to ask you to indicate your primary research organization. So if McGill is the closest one that you can find in that list, then that's fine to say that. Then once you click an organization, it's going to ask you which DMP template you would like to use. So you'll be able to click that drop down menu. And I'm sorry, it's in the very small text, but you would see a list of the discipline specific ones. So template for open science workflows, template for neuroimaging and the neurosciences, there's a ton of them. And they're going to add more. And at the bottom, you see there's a University of Alberta template. So if that was your institution, you would have an institution specific one too. At some point in the future, there will be a McGill one, but it's not there yet. So there's 13 right now, and I know that they have 10 more coming out. So keep an eye out because some of them will be more directly relevant to CIHR funding streams, for example. So each DMP has study level information. So on the first page, you would put in some project details like the title, you could put in the grant number if you already know, and an abstract. And then you get to the plan itself. So this is the template called mixed methods. And you would see that there's some collapsible menus that have different categories like data collection, documentation, storage, and backup. These are more or less the same across most of the templates. Like this is really the meat of a DMP, is going through all of these sort of research data lifecycle stages and discussing what you're going to do. So here's an example of one where it has customized guidance. So you can see on the left-hand side that there's basically what it does is it asks you a series of questions, and then you have an open text box where you can provide the answer. So it prompts you to respond to questions that then you can piece together all of your responses into a really cohesive plan. And you can see on the right-hand side that there's guidance. So if you had a discipline-specific template, it would have guidance for that specific discipline. So in the neuroimaging template, it talks about, the bid standards, and it links to things like maybe you want to use this type of file that's really common with MRI imaging. So it has these kind of resources to sort of prompt you on what's a correct response. There's no right or wrong, but there's sort of better and more and less and more vague, I would guess. So the more detailed, the better. So here someone's talking about collecting survey data with REDCap. They explain what that is. And they talk about what they're going to include with their qualitative interview data. And they have a file naming convention that they talk about as well. So you can easily add collaborators under the share tab in the tool. You could add someone based on their email address. So as long as they have an account, you can invite them. And then you can give them different types of permissions. And then at the very end, you can download it in whatever kind of format that makes sense. And so now I'm going to go into some examples, and I can go back and answer any questions about the tool at the end as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some examples related to specific funder requirements. So you may be aware or you may not be aware, but earlier this year, CIHR announced that for all clinical trials, they're going to start requiring data management plans applying for funding. So what they released one project over the summer. It had a deadline in July. And the instructions were that all of the applications must incorporate all of the following key design elements. So they wanted a 3-page plan in English, 4 in French, and they called it a data governance plan. So that's the same thing as a data management plan, but it's slightly more high level. And they also buried very deep into the call, discussed what do they mean by data governance plan. So they define it as a strategy for how data will be stored, linked, and shared as appropriate. Research data managed by the clinical team, trial team must be as fair as possible, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the data governance plan must outline how the FAIR principles will be applied. So this is really interesting because the FAIR principles really don't come in to play with research data until the very end of a project. Your data can't really, whether it's fair or not is irrelevant while you're actively working on the project. FAIR really refers to data that are deposited somewhere at the end that support the findings of a publication. So the interesting thing of this requirement would be that you would be discussing your data management of your project with the aim of depositing the data in some format or some version of the data set, I suppose an anonymized version if it's human participants. And they would want you to discuss more on what your intentions are about where that would be deposited. What kinds of files are you depositing? Are they going to be accessible? What kind of terms and conditions are you going to apply to your data when you deposit it, right? So they're looking for that kind of description, and they're looking for the management of the data over the course of the project to line up such that at the end of your project, it's going to be feasible to make them fair in that way, right? So this all plays into the feasibility of a project. And ties into, how likely is it that it's going to get to that point where those data will be released. So this is really interesting. And then there was another one that just was released, I think last week or the week before. This is a network grant from CIHR. And this one is the grant that they've chosen to explicitly pilot data management plans. So they're saying now that the plan is mandatory. It should describe how the network will manage research data generated as part of its activities. Data management plans should describe what data are expected to be collected, created, linked to, acquired, or recorded, how data will be documented, formatted, protected, and preserved, where the data will be deposited, and whether and how the data will be shared within and outside the network, and any ethical, legal, and commercial constraints the data are subject to. And applicants are encouraged to use DMP Assistant to create their data management plan. So here they've explicitly asked for the data management plan assistant tool to be used. And they've also mentioned, I should note, that they will not be scored. So what they're going to ask juries to do, or reviewers to do in this case, is to sort of give some general feedback about the plan, but not to consider it in the overall score of the grant application, with the intention of looking at how that process works, evaluating it, doing it again, I suppose, in a few more funding opportunities. And I imagine, or what they've sort of implied, is that at that point they will sit down and think about, is there a rubric that we should attach to this to score this actually? But I think the intention is that at some point they will be. So I wanted to go through a couple of examples of how would you respond using the prompts from the DMP Assistant tool. So the generic template, the generic just form in the tool starts off with asking you what type of data you're going to be collecting in the process of your research. So it asks you these questions of sort of what types of data will you collect? What file formats will your data be collected in? Will these formats allow for data reuse, sharing, and long-term access to the data? What conventions and procedures will you use to structure, name, and version control your files to help you and others better understand how your data are organized? So they're sort of trying to lead you to construct an answer that incorporates enough detail that convinces others that the project is really feasible and that you have a good grasp on managing the data as well. By asking you sort of, will these formats allow for data reuse and long-term access? What they're really telling you is is there a way to make these file formats open access, like open file formats that are not proprietary? If so, be explicit about that, right? So it's asking you to be very explicit about what the format is of the data you're collecting and what will happen if you try to give that to someone else. In some cases, you're collecting data from tools that are proprietary and there's no alternative and there's no way to convert them into an open format. In that case, that's fine, but the expectation would be that you would articulate that very explicitly, that that's a constraint on being able to put the data in a format that's archival, that's in an archival format or preservation ready. The conventions, when they're asking about file naming conventions, what they really want is like, very detailed, like the file name will have the date and the initials of the person who created the file. It will have an acronym for the topic. And whatever else other information that might be needed, so that when you see the name of the file, you A, immediately know what's in the file, and B, everyone is creating their files and using the same convention in your group, so that there's not any confusion about that file, what is in there versus what is in that file. Are those related? Are those the same things? So being really explicit about that, and even giving examples of how people name the files. Like, here's our convention, here's an example of the file. So here's an example from a neuroscience application that they've allowed us to use for training purposes. So this comes from someone's DMP. So when they're asked to describe the type of data to be collected, they've said that the project involves the collection of MRI data. However, given that we will use exclusively participants that are recruited as part of a larger project, we will have access to participants' clinical data for patients and scores at a series of neuropsychological assessments for both patients and controls. As much as possible, we will use open or non-proprietary formats. So just a note here that you might not know in advance of doing a project if you're able to convert all the files into an open format, but you can convey that that's your intention, right? And that's fine. The MRI data will use the nifty open file format, the physiology data will use CSV, and the pre-process and scripts will use text. So those are open formats. I mean, you could even go further and say these are open formats. So they talk about converting the MRI data, and having the metadata files in JSON, which I would even go further and say those are machine readable, which helps the data set become fair. So anything that you can put in there that helps to connect back to what the funders want, which is that they want the data to be fair, deposited somewhere accessible, and they want other researchers to understand how they can reuse it or under what conditions they could reuse it. So they're not saying they have to be open. There's no open data policy. It's more about like just being very clear about what are the terms of using that data and under what condition. And then they talk about, I mean, the nice thing about neuroscience and neurology data is that they do have a standard for structuring data in directory formats. So they can easily say, we're going to use the standard. And then, that sounds much more feasible and credible to that community, to researchers in that community. So you would want to, as much as possible, think about what is the most credible, feasible thing we can do with the data that signals that, we put some thought into this and that we're organized, essentially. And then I'll look at one more example about sharing and reuse. So once you get through the full DMP Assistant tool, it will ask you some questions about what data will you be sharing and in what form. So what it means is, are you sharing your raw data? Are you sharing some kind of minimal data set that underlies the publication that the agency has funded? So what version of that data set are you sharing? And I guess what's the justification for that? Have you considered what type of end user license to include in your data? So these questions, they're asking you, have you considered this? But the answer is, I did consider it, and this is the license I'm going to use. So, the questions are kind of like trick questions because they're really telling you what you actually should write in your plan, and you want to think about like the most explicit way to answer that question, the least vague way to answer it. I am using this specific license for this reason, right? So what steps will be taken to help the research community know that your data exists? So this is different from just the article. So I think the funders want to know, how are you sharing your research findings? In this case, it's really about how are you going to make it known that there's a data set out there that could be valuable to other researchers, not just for reproducibility, but also to sort of innovate on, right? So in that case, the answer is sort of like, it will be in an indexed data repository that is, so that means when you search Google, it will come up. You will find that data. Like if you look for data related to my study or the topic of my study, it's in a repository that makes that happen, right? So that's one of the, or I'm also going to link to it in my article, and that way anyone who reads the article will find the data set, things like that. And those are the sort of best practices. So what we're trying to get at is like the response is the best practice normally, if you can feasibly commit to that, I suppose I should say too. So here's an example of a response to that from one of the recent funding calls. So the anonymized data sets, process data, and metadata will be deposited in a domain-specific public repository, and that's the sort of jargon that funders and journals ask for. They ask specifically for public repository. If the domain-specific public repository does not have features that enable fair data, the data will be deposited in the Borealis Dataverse, which is McGill. It's the Canadian installation of open source software Dataverse, which is a repository software. And it allows for making the data fair. We have an instance of this at McGill. So we have a McGill Dataverse. I administer the Dataverse, and it's open to anyone affiliated with McGill, whether or not you have the central affiliation. So anyone at a research hospital who wants to deposit data, or a research institute who wants to deposit data at the Dataverse is totally welcome to do so. So that's totally fine. We can facilitate that. And I think we do have a few data sets that are anonymized human clinic, like formally clinical, transferred to a research setting, scrubbed of all identifying information, and are related to publications that have been published. And those data sets are pretty well, the impact is pretty high. I think we had one that underlied some study in some biomedical field, but it had like 12,000 downloads already. So, people are using these data. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's a deterrent to some people, but for me, I think that's a pretty cool measure of impact in a way as well, in addition to the article. So just something to be aware of. To ensure that data underlying any articles from this study are as fair as possible, and to allow for reproducibility and reuse, we intend to license the data using a public domain license. It's the most open license. You're retaining no copyright over the data set, and you're not even asking anyone to cite you on the data. So that's just like free for all, everyone use it. Like, we're totally happy to contribute this as to the common good. So if you're thinking about that CIHR funding opportunity that asked you to describe, how you're going to make your data fair, this is a pretty great response, I would say. I mean, I can't tell you if this person got funded, but it would, the DMP is not going to make or break any funding at this point. But I would say, if you get to that point where people really care about it, you cannot get better than saying it will be publicly available with no copyright. It will be fair. And we're going to, when we have this intention to really make that possible, and we've cited some data repositories, which gives us some credibility in terms of that we'll follow through with that, if that makes sense. And I'm going to end with a few general tips. And I know we're not quite at anywhere near the hour, but usually there's questions. So who knows? Sometimes there's a lot of questions, sometimes there's not. So I wanted to give folks the chance in that case. But just some general tips. Your peers are your reviewers. Your peers will judge you about your data management practices, right? So that could be good or bad. In some fields, people are yeah, no one cares. That's great. I mean, at some point, everyone will care. So it's, it's moving more slowly in some fields. And in other fields, there's a really high level of, people making their data fair or publishing it, or there's a lot of pressure from journals to do this and from other researchers. So if you can't describe that well, it's not going to look good. And even if someone is not scoring your DMP, if they're reading it as part of your application and it's very vague and very concerning to someone, it might make them overall concerned about the feasibility of a project, right? And so you can't really, as a jury member, as a reviewer of grant applications, it's very hard to ignore some piece of information when you're looking at many applications and you're thinking about them holistically. So just something to be aware of, even if they're not scored, that information can impact how people think about your project, right? Just as if you describe your methodology and there's some concerns there, it's too vague. So it's the same with managing data. So I also wanted to note that DMP Assistant is specifically mentioned in these funding opportunities. They are expecting the data management plans to sort of conform to that template model. You definitely have flexibility. You don't have to use it. You don't have to answer all the questions by any means at all. It's really what's relevant to you, what will help you describe it in a way that meets the criteria in the funding opportunity call that they've asked for. But I will say that the tri-agencies are looking at that tool as the sort of standard, right? And so and if many researchers are using it and you go rogue, then when they're comparing yours to other DMPs, they're going to wonder like what happened. It just makes it easier for the reviewers as well to have this sort of standardized document that everyone is working off of. And just to note that the more rigorous your data management practices are in general, the easier it is to write a robust and compelling data management plan, right? So if you're already implementing a lot of these practices, if you have file naming conventions, if you're onboarding trainees and you're making them name their files all in a really specific way, if you have a folder structure that's standardized, everyone has the same, documentation folder, a data folder, a raw data folder, a process data folder, outputs folder that has all the publications. If everyone's doing this in a really organized way already, it's easy to write it up and describe that. And if you've already, practiced sort of publishing your data or depositing it or sharing it, if that's built into your standard procedures now, then it's easier to describe that in the plan as well. And you can also talk about institutional resources in your DMP. So at McGill, there's a service called the Digital Research Services, which is a team that I work on as well. It's through VPRI. So it's anyone affiliated with McGill, and we even do some work with the RIMUHC and some of the affiliated hospitals in terms of the strategic level of data management and coordinating that. So you could talk about that in your grant. Like, we have these services, we have experts. We rely on them to help us do X, Y, Z, right? So I've been working with a team at the Douglas for a long time to sort of create a README document for their whole group that has standard file naming conventions, that has a table with all the acronyms that they use and definitions, that has a table with all the file paths for all the data, that has a diagram of the folder structure they want all their trainees to use. And we've spent like quite a long time piloting this and discussing it, and they have a ton of trainees and several PIs. So it's a really tough, to sort of standardize that for everyone and make it work for every kind of data that's being collected. They have some data that's not sensitive at all, and they have some data that has health information. So it's very tricky, but in the end, they have this really robust document that has a diagram of their folder structure. It has a file naming convention. Anytime any of them go to write a grant, they can just pull all that information from that document, and they look very credible, and their project looks very feasible because they're already implementing these practices. So just a note about that. And I'll end there and let anyone ask questions if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, Alisa. That was really, really good. And good to know that it will be expected of us in our future grant applications. So let's see. Feel free to ask questions in the chat or by raising your hand. I'll start. Can you elaborate a bit on this end user agreement? That's in reference to people who might want to use the data in the future, like after the study is closed, or is that something else?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it is. So the idea is that when you've finished a project or you've started publishing articles, rather, actually. So you've published an article, either the journal or the funder might say, you have to make the data that, produce the evidence in your paper that you cite, like tables, charts, numbers, statistics, whatever it may be. Those data have to be available somewhere at the very minimum for someone to reproduce that or to verify those findings. So the best practice now is to make those data fair, and that means putting them in a public repository. So publishing the data on their own. In that process, most public repositories will allow you to apply a license to the data that allows others to know if they download it, what can they do with it. And so most of those are going to be Creative Commons licenses. So things like there's the public domain. So you can do whatever you want with it. There's the one where it's like CC BY. So you can do whatever you want with it, but you have to cite me. And then there's like less open licenses. So there's ones that have non-commercial use as part of the, you can do whatever you want as long as it's not for commercial purposes. So there's about 5 or 6 of them. So there's not like an infinite number. It's not that exhaustive, but it covers most scenarios. And the idea being that you're just trying to convey very clearly what it is someone can do with those data at the end of the project. And those might be the de-identified version of a data set that was used. It might be, you know, images that have been anonymized in some way. So most of what we're talking about would be like a not sensitive data set that would be shared in that way. If that makes sense.
And no, it makes tons of sense. And in retrospect, it's one of these things that it's hard to imagine that we didn't have all of these standards before, because I guess it's helpful to think of this prospectively, because really it needs to be mentioned in the consent form,
Yes.
where this stuff is going to end up, who might use it, and what way they might use it. And so I guess I have 2 related follow-up questions. So one is the end user agreement. How, like, at what level of detail are we talking? Like, this is the sort of data use agreement form that we're going to send to people who might reach out to access it? Or is it simply saying we're going to, you know, post this on, we're going to get consent and post the data on a public server, like maybe the McGill one you mentioned, under this sort of Creative Commons X, Y, or Z, and that's sufficient? Or it can be any of the above?
So it's really not the data use agreement level. It could be any of the above, actually. I would say, to make it fair, you want to use these sort of machine readable licenses, and those are the Creative Commons ones, because what they're trying to accomplish is really like, you search in Google for data about something or information about something, and machines that link data that are related to each other based on like these like sort of fields that they can understand, they are able to do that. And so if you search for data and I want data that I could use for commercial purposes, then it will return those results. And it can only do that if you use these kinds of like machine readable licenses. If you have data that you want to share, but you have like very special, they have to do an REB, they have to sign a data use agreement. You could normally put like custom terms of use on the data. And you can say like, I can't put the full data set here. If you want the data set with like the personal information and all this stuff, you have to go through these steps. If you want the anonymized one, it's here open freely. Or, so you could sort of think about, you could do them both, or either, essentially. So I actually have a slide in another presentation that has an overview of the Creative Commons licenses. So I'm just trying to pull it up quickly. So the licenses for data sets that for Creative Commons there's only like, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's 5. So there's like open ones, which is public domain, or like essentially public domain, but you must cite me, so that's CC BY. There's other kinds of licenses that you might need for software, for example, or code. But in general, for data, we use the CC licenses. I've also had folks deposit data in the McGill Dataverse, and so someone had like StatsCan data. So it's like, they had gotten some open-ended survey question data from a StatsCan survey, and it had been stripped of all identifying information, but it had like thousands of open-ended comments in the data set. So they were like, there's no way we can go through and ensure that someone didn't self-identify themselves in this data. Like someone might have said, I'm at McGill and blah, blah, blah. And they said, we tried really hard. Like we used a program to do it. We did it eyeballing all of them. We may have missed it. So they made a custom term where it said, in order to use these data, you agree to, if you find identifiable information, to inform us and delete it and to not use it. If you agree to not try to connect this with other data to re-identify people who may have responded to the survey. So they put their own custom terms. And so it can be quite tricky. And if you do want to have like custom terms, or if you want to have a license, you do have to consent people to it. So that is something that you would need to know in advance, even in advance of your would have to be built into that consent form. And I've had a couple researchers this year who did research related to COVID. So they got grants that required the data to be openly available because it's COVID data, and it's very explicit, like you must publish those data set under a public domain license at the end of the project. But they realized at the end of the project that they hadn't consented the participants for it. And so they couldn't publish it, like it would be totally unethical. So they were violating a term of the grant, but they were in like this really hard place of having to choose one or the other, right? And I think that's sort of like something that a granting agency might think like, okay, that's like a mistake, but I don't think your intentions were to not do this from the beginning. But at the same time, like we have to start being careful about what we're making commitments to the funders to versus what we can commit in our REBs in terms of like how the data will be handled. I typically now recommend in consent forms to have two consent, to have the consent to the study and have a separate paragraph that says I consent to have my data published, so that they can consent to be in the study and not feel pressure to have their data shared at the end of the project. So I did that in a recent study where I did interviews. So I have two levels. So I, like 80% said they were fine with their de-identified interview transcripts being shared in a public repository, but 20% said no, and they would not have otherwise consented to the study. So something to be really careful about.
Yeah, I mean, looking at that list, I could see as you get to like commercial use and stuff, you don't want to deter potential participants, but so I think that sort of separate section where you opt in, opt out makes a lot of sense to maximize your enrollment.
You don't want to deter them, and on the same time, like a lot of health research is done in partnership with commercial entities. So that might actually restrict you from using the non-commercial licenses as well. So it might work the other way as well, depending on, who's the research partner.
There's a question from Elena in the chat asking, well, thanking you for the presentation and asking for grants where it's not required yet. Should we be adding the DMP anyhow? Will it be considered in the application?
So I would say at this point, they will have, it's like a special appendix that you add. So I don't think that you would necessarily need to do that in the ones I would do it only for the ones where they're asking, frankly. But when you talk about your methodology in your grant application, you can put a line or two in there about your intention to share the data or not. For example, if you work in a field where people value that, in a discipline where people value data sharing, or where you feel like it's moving in that direction, or you want to push it in that direction, then I think it's worth sparing a line or two in your methodology section about that, potentially, because it is related to methodology in the end as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I think it shows a level of, I think, kind of sophistication and just.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can only signal that you are like very organized. Do you know what I mean? Which can never be a bad thing, I think. So when you're doing data management, you have all this planned out and you do this in practice, in your lab or in your research, and you can talk about it in these applications, you're going to have an advantage. Like that, there's no way that can disadvantage you, I think.
I know actually a lot of the high, top tier journals,
they're going to require it now. So yeah.
It shows that you're thinking ambitiously about where your data is going to land or where your study is going to land.
Yeah, exactly. And I think most top journals will require you to make that data set that's related to that publication available. There's been some pretty infamous retractions even in the last couple of years. I'm sure the ones that I'm thinking of are coming to your mind as well, for like bad data reasons or like fraud related to the data in the biomedical realm as well. So I think that the more that happens, the more scrutiny there's going to be on the data being available in a way that is easily reproducible, right? And that's easier said than done. So you might think like, that's fine, I'll just release the data set I use, but that's not enough to reproduce a paper. Like it has to be organized, it has to have documentation. People need to be able to find it. And so that involves having metadata and, thinking about that in advance as well.
So maybe to conclude, I just have one last question about where to host this sort of data. So you mentioned that McGill can host these data in like, is it, so as an RI researcher, let's say I'm making my DMP and I want to host the data after my study closes. What are the details here? Is it free? Am I eligible to host it? Is it sort of that easy?
Yeah, it's that easy. So for the Dataverse, if you want to like deposit that data set, so once you publish data on the Dataverse, it's not reversible. It's like it's published. And it's not really meant for like storing data long term. It's really meant to publish that data set that's linked to an article. Anyone at, with any kind of like very tangential relationship to McGill is totally welcome to do that. You should, if you have an affiliate email account, you should just be able to log in with that. And if not, you can just email me and I can help you set up an account. So that's fine. So you can do that. And that's part of the Borealis Dataverse. It's a Canadian Dataverse network. Each academic institution in Canada has an instance of it, and it's sort of managed centrally through the University of Toronto. Oops, the PowerPoint hasn't been available. I can send it to the organizers and they can distribute it. Is that how that normally works?
Yeah, we can figure something out, either have it a link to it on our RI website, on the core website, or store it in the McGill Dataverse. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So you're saying that, I was just confused there. You said that it's not a store. I mean, you're saying it's not meant as like a dynamic, like it's not a place where
it's not meant as a dynamic. No. Yeah, that gets more tricky, like the active management of data. So for the RI, I think if you don't otherwise have a central McGill affiliation, I'm not actually sure what the solutions are. But if you do have a central McGill affiliation at all, you can use McGill's Microsoft products to store data as like during the active part of your research, and they have quite a lot of storage. So if that's an option for you, I would say that's what we recommend to all the researchers in terms of like, it backs it up 3 times. They've signed Quebec's privacy, like an agreement with Quebec about, the privacy. So it's like basically the most secure cloud storage you could have if you can put your data on the cloud, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot, Alisa, and thanks to everyone for joining. See you next week. Bye.